Sometimes the most chilling words don't come from a villain or a threat, but from the innocent mouth of a child. When a little girl whispered into a 911 phone call, it only hurts the first time. It sent shivers down the spine of the dispatcher on the other end. No one could have guessed that those 7 words would uncover a story of desperation, deception, and a mother's struggle to protect her daughter. Before we begin today's story, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing people from all over the world coming together to share in these stories. Now settle in, relax, and listen closely, because the one you're about to hear begins with a call that no one could forget. The 911 dispatcher had taken thousands of calls in her career. She'd heard panic in every tone imaginable: car accidents, house fires, medical emergencies, even people who just dialed by mistake. But on this ordinary evening, as the fluorescent lights hummed above her desk, something in her gut told her that this call was different the very moment the line clicked open. 911, what's your emergency? She asked, her voice practiced yet gentle. There was a pause, a silence that seemed to stretch far longer than it actually was. Then, through the static of the line, came a voice so soft and fragile that the dispatcher leaned forward instinctively, as though her body could somehow draw the words closer. It was a child, a little girl. He said, the child whispered, her voice trembling. It only hurts the first time. For a moment, the dispatcher froze. The words didn't make sense, and yet, deep in her bones, she knew they meant something terrible. She straightened in her chair, typing rapidly to log the call. Sweetheart, are you safe? Can you tell me your name? She asked carefully, her tone instinctively shifting to one of softness, like a mother coaxing a secret from a child. There was another pause, a shaky breath, then a name, Nora. The dispatcher's fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing the call to a modest neighborhood on the east side of town. She flagged the call immediately for officer response. Within seconds, radios crackled to life. Across town, Officer Daniel Wyatt was at his desk, drowning in paperwork. At 53 years old, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of weary eyes that had seen far too much over the decades, Daniel was the veteran officer everyone turned to when the situation demanded not just force, but wisdom. He had a way of listening that made even the most frightened people feel heard, and a quiet strength that reassured the vulnerable. When he heard the recording of the call, just 7 simple words spoken by a trembling child, something in him shifted. His chest tightened, and instinct took over. I'll take it, Daniel said, pushing back his chair before anyone else had time to volunteer. He grabbed his keys, his jacket, and within moments was on his way to Oak Ridge Heights. The sun was dipping low on the horizon as he drove, washing the rows of modest homes in a muted orange glow. Oak Ridge Heights wasn't a rich neighborhood, but it wasn't the worst either. It was the kind of place where families worked 2 or 3 jobs just to stay afloat, where every house carried quiet stories of struggle and resilience. Daniel slowed as he approached the address, a small 2-bedroom home with fading blue paint and neatly trimmed hedges out front. It looked ordinary, completely unremarkable, and yet, he knew from experience that appearances could lie. He parked at the curb and took a deep breath. Years of service had taught him that first impressions mattered, especially when children were involved. He rehearsed his approach in his mind, calm, non-threatening, patient. Then, stepping up to the porch, he knocked. The door opened to reveal a woman in her early 30s. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her eyes carried the heavy weariness of someone who had been fighting battles alone for far too long. Her polo shirt bore the logo of a local coffee shop. Daniel recognized the look instantly. Someone either just coming home from work or heading out to another shift. Ms. Whitman? Daniel asked softly. I'm Officer Wyatt. We received a call from this address. The woman's brow furrowed. A call? There must be some mistake. It's just me and my daughter here, and I've been home the past hour. Daniel kept his expression neutral, his voice gentle. Would it be alright if I came in for just a moment? I just need to make sure everything is okay. Something flickered in the woman's eyes then, hesitation, maybe fear, but she nodded and stepped aside. The living room was small, but tidy. A worn couch sat against one wall, and mismatched furniture filled the space in a way that suggested function over style. The walls, however, told a different story, bright with a child's artwork, colorful drawings taped up with care. Daniel noticed the details others might overlook. A stack of unopened bills on the counter, a calendar crowded with work shifts, and the way the woman's hands fidgeted even when she tried to keep them still. Is your daughter home? Daniel asked. The woman, Gina Whitman, nodded. Nora. Yes, she's in her room. She hasn't been feeling well lately. I was just about to check on her before heading to my second job. Her voice lowered with the last sentence, tinged with quiet guilt. And as if summoned by her name, a small figure appeared at the end of the hallway. Daniel's heart clenched. Nora was about 6 years old, but her eyes looked much older, solemn, guarded, watchful. She clutched a teddy bear close to her chest, holding it so tightly that her little knuckles turned white. What caught Daniel's eye most wasn't just her unusual quietness, nor the way she seemed to study him with wary suspicion. It was the bandages, carefully placed band-aids on her wrist, and identical ones wrapped around the teddy bear's arm. Daniel crouched down, lowering himself to the little girl's eye level. His voice softened. "Hey there. My name's Daniel. I like your bear. What's his name?" The girl glanced at her mother before whispering, "Mr. Hugs." "That's a great name," Daniel said warmly. His gaze flickered to the matching bandages. "I noticed Mr. Hugs has bandages just like you. Did you both get hurt?" The child's grip on the bear tightened. "Mr. Hugs gets the same medicine I do," she murmured. "So he knows it's okay." Something in Daniel's chest constricted. In nearly 3 decades on the force, he developed a sixth sense for when something was wrong. That sense screamed at him now. The air in the room carried a faint smell, medicinal, sterile, like rubbing alcohol mixed with something herbal he couldn't quite place. He filed it away mentally. Behind him, Gina shifted uncomfortably. "Nora, honey," she said quickly, "why don't you go back to your room while I talk to the officer?" But Daniel wasn't ready to let go just yet. He watched as the small girl hesitated, then turned and padded down the hallway, her teddy bear still clutched close. Her tiny shoulders slumped, and the way she held herself struck Daniel as far too heavy for a child her age. When she was gone, Daniel turned back to Gina. Her expression had shifted from confusion to something more defensive, almost guarded. "Ms. Whitman," Daniel began gently, "I'm not here to cause trouble. But someone did call 911 from this address, and I need to understand what's happening. How long has Nora been unwell?" Gina let out a weary sigh, sinking onto the edge of the couch. "It's been on and off for months now. Fevers, stomach pains, fatigue." She rubbed her temples, as though the weight of it all was pressing down on her. "I've been doing everything I can, but it's hard. I work 2 jobs just to keep a roof over our heads." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing every detail. He looked around the modest room again. Despite its worn appearance, there was evidence of love and effort everywhere. Children's books neatly arranged on a shelf. A homemade chore chart covered in star stickers. School drawings proudly taped on the wall. This wasn't a home of neglect, but one of struggle. "Have you taken her to see a doctor?" he asked. Gina hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I tried at first, but the appointments always conflicted with my shifts, and I couldn't risk losing my job. And then the bills," her voice trailed off. "Our insurance barely covers anything. I just couldn't keep up." Her words carried no indifference, only desperation. Daniel made a mental note. Economic hardship, not neglect. But still, something wasn't right. "So," he asked carefully, "what have you been doing for her care in the meantime?" At that, Gina's expression changed. A spark of relief, almost gratitude, lit her tired features. "Brian's been helping us," she said. "Brian Keller. He's been a godsend, really." Daniel kept his tone neutral. "And who is Brian?" "A friend," Gina said quickly. "Well, we dated briefly, but we're just friends now. He has training in natural medicine. He's been giving Nora treatments that seem to help, at least temporarily. He doesn't even charge me. Says he just wants to help." Daniel nodded thoughtfully, though inside his instincts flared like alarm bells. Before he could press further, a knock sounded at the door. Gina looked startled, then almost relieved. That's probably him now. He usually stops by in the evenings to check on Nora. Daniel turned toward the door just as it opened. There, standing on the threshold, was a man in his mid-30s. Clean-cut, neatly dressed, carrying a leather medical bag in one hand. His smile was warm, practiced. A lanyard hung around his neck, displaying some kind of ID badge. "Gina," he greeted warmly, before faltering as his eyes landed on Daniel. "Oh, I didn't realize you had company." "Brian, this is Officer Wyatt," Gina explained quickly. "He's here because apparently someone called 911 from our house." Brian's expression shifted just slightly, surprise, then immediate concern. "Is everything all right? Is Nora okay?" Daniel extended his hand. "Mr. Keller, I understand you've been helping with Nora's treatments." Brian's grip was firm, just the right amount of pressure, his voice smooth. "Natural wellness support," he corrected. I'm a certified natural health practitioner. I've been giving Nora immune-boosting supplements and vitamin therapy. Nothing invasive, just holistic care. Daniel studied him carefully. Outwardly, Brian seemed confident, articulate, compassionate. But something about the perfection of his presentation felt rehearsed. Too smooth, too controlled. And then, from the hallway, a small voice drifted into the room. "Do I need another shot today?" Daniel's head turned sharply. There stood little Nora, clutching Mr. Hugs, her wide eyes fixed on Brian. Brian's smile didn't falter. "Just vitamins today, sweetheart," he said, his tone almost playful. "Remember what I always say." The girl nodded solemnly. "It only hurts the first time." The words sent a chill down Daniel's spine. In that moment, he knew this was no ordinary wellness visit. And he wasn't leaving this house until he found out the truth. The silence in the room hung heavy after those words. Daniel felt every hair on the back of his neck stand on end. "It only hurts the first time." Spoken so innocently, yet carrying a weight no child should ever have to bear. He looked at Brian carefully. The man's smile never faltered, but his eyes flickered, just for a split second, betraying something. Annoyance, calculation, perhaps fear. Gina, however, seemed almost relieved that Brian was here. Her shoulders relaxed, as though his presence lifted some invisible burden. "See, Nora trusts him," she said, trying to reassure Daniel. "He's been helping us. You don't understand how much better she's been since Brian started coming by." Daniel didn't respond immediately. Years on the force had taught him that silence was often more powerful than words. He let the quiet stretch, watching Brian, who finally turned and set his medical bag on the table with practiced ease. "I brought something new today," Brian announced casually, as though the presence of a police officer was merely a minor inconvenience. He pulled out small bottles filled with clear liquid, the kind of thing that might look ordinary to someone desperate for help. But to Daniel, every piece screamed unregulated, unofficial, and potentially dangerous. "What exactly are those?" Daniel asked evenly. "Natural immune support," Brian replied smoothly. "A proprietary blend of vitamins and minerals. Safe, holistic, and most importantly effective. Families trust me because I take the time traditional doctors won't." Daniel didn't miss the subtle jab. It was the same script men like Brian always used. Set themselves up as the savior, paint the medical system as the villain. For a struggling mother like Gina, who had already been dismissed and overburdened by that very system, it was a dangerously persuasive message. Nora shifted uneasily, pressing her face into her teddy bear. Daniel's gaze softened as he looked at her, but inside, his instincts screamed. Something here was very wrong. "I'd like to speak with someone about this," Daniel said finally, stepping toward the door. "Excuse me a moment." Outside, the evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass from nearby yards. Daniel pulled out his phone and scrolled to a familiar number. It rang only twice before a steady, warm voice answered. "Margaret Pierce speaking." "Margaret, it's Daniel," he said, keeping his voice low. "I need your help with a situation." At 72 years old, Margaret had officially retired from social services years ago, but anyone who knew her also knew she never really stopped. She was a volunteer child advocate now, the kind of woman who could walk into any room and command respect without ever raising her voice. Her decades of experience and her unshakable compassion made her Daniel's first call whenever a child's safety was in question. "Tell me what you're seeing," she said immediately, her tone brisk but not unkind. Daniel described everything. The trembling voice on the 911 call, the bandaged bear, the sickly child with wary eyes, the exhausted mother, and finally Brian Keller, this so-called healer with his unmarked bottles and evasive answers. "And Margaret," Daniel added, his voice tightening, "the little girl mentioned shots. Brian called them vitamins." And she repeated a phrase, "It only hurts the first time." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Margaret's voice came, steady and resolute. "I'm on my way. 20 minutes. Relief flickered through Daniel. "Thank you." He slipped his phone back into his pocket and turned toward the house. Through the thin curtains, he could see silhouettes at the kitchen table. Brian leaning forward, gesturing smoothly as he unpacked more small bottles, and Gina nodding along, grateful for his attention. Daniel's jaw tightened. When he stepped back inside, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Brian's smile was still in place, but his eyes tracked Daniel's every movement now watchful. "Everything okay, officer?" Brian asked lightly. "Yes," Daniel said, keeping his tone calm. He turned to Gina. "Ms. Whitman, I've asked a child welfare specialist to stop by. Her name is Margaret Pierce." She's a volunteer advocate who helps families navigate situations like this. She'll be here shortly. Gina froze, her face paling. Am I in trouble? Daniel shook his head. No, this isn't about trouble. It's about support. From what you've told me, you're doing your best under difficult circumstances. Margaret may be able to connect you with resources you don't know about. Brian interjected smoothly, his voice carrying that polished edge that Daniel was starting to recognize as rehearsed. That's very kind, officer, but Gina and Nora are already receiving excellent care. I'm not sure involving more people is necessary. Actually, Daniel replied, meeting his gaze evenly, when a child calls 911, protocol requires a thorough follow-up. Ms. Pierce's assessment will help complete my report. Something flickered in Brian's eyes. His smile remained, but Daniel noticed it didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. Perhaps I should come back another time, Brian said, beginning to slide the bottles back into his bag. I'd appreciate it if you stayed, Daniel countered. Margaret will likely value your input on Nora's treatment plan. The words were polite, but the undertone was clear. You're not going anywhere. Brian hesitated for a fraction of a second, then gave a thin smile and sat back down, though his grip on his medical bag tightened. Minutes later, a knock came at the door. Gina opened it hesitantly to reveal a petite woman with silver hair pulled back neatly and sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She wore a cardigan despite the mild evening, and carried a worn leather satchel slung across her shoulder. Ms. Whitman? I'm Margaret Pierce, she said warmly. Thank you for letting me visit. Her voice carried a natural authority, gentle, reassuring, yet firm enough to settle any doubts. Gina stepped aside, and Margaret entered, her presence immediately shifting the energy of the room. Introductions were made quickly. Margaret wasted no time before asking if she could speak with Nora. Gina hesitated, glancing toward Brian, who gave a small nod as though granting permission. That subtle dynamic wasn't lost on Daniel. Gina seemed to defer to Brian far more than she realized. Together, Margaret and Gina led Nora into her bedroom. Daniel stayed behind in the kitchen with Brian, who watched the hallway intently, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the table. Inside the small bedroom, string lights twinkled faintly above the bed, paper stars hanging from the ceiling in uneven rows. It was a child's sanctuary, lovingly decorated despite its simplicity. Nora sat cross-legged on her bed, Mr. Huggs clutched in her arms, her big eyes wary but curious. Hello, Nora, Margaret said gently, sitting down on the edge of the bed. My name is Margaret. I love your stars. Did you make them? Nora gave the smallest nod. And who's this? Margaret gestured toward the bear. Mr. Huggs, the little girl whispered. He looks very brave with all those bandages, Margaret observed. May I ask why he needs them? The child's gaze flicked toward the door, then back to Margaret. So he won't be scared when he gets his medicine. I show him it's okay. Margaret's smile was soft, but her eyes carried quiet concern. That's very kind of you. Does your medicine hurt sometimes? Nora lowered her gaze to the bear and recited in a flat tone, as though repeating something she'd been taught. Only the first time. Mr. Brian says that's normal. Margaret's heart squeezed. She reached out, brushing a stray curl of hair from the girl's forehead. Thank you for telling me, sweetheart. You're very brave. Meanwhile, back in the kitchen, Daniel tried to draw Brian out with small talk. Mr. Keller, you mentioned you trained at the Institute of Natural Wellness. I'm not familiar with it. Is that local? Brian's eyes flicked toward him, sharp for just a moment before softening again. It's an online certification program. Very rigorous, internationally recognized. And these treatments you're providing, Daniel pressed casually, they're all approved for children? Brian leaned forward, his voice smooth. Officer, I understand your concern, but I've helped dozens of families when traditional medicine failed them. When overworked doctors dismiss symptoms, I listen. Would you rather Gina watch her daughter suffer because she can't afford proper care? It was a skilled deflection, Daniel noted. Position himself as the hero, appeal to emotion, dodge the question entirely. Before he could push further, Margaret returned from the bedroom. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Daniel had known her long enough to read between the lines. She was concerned, deeply concerned. Ms. Whitman, she said gently, I think we need to talk. The kitchen became a circle of quiet tension. Gina sat down at the table, wringing her hands. Daniel stood nearby, his posture steady but alert. Brian remained standing, medical bag now closed, his body angled slightly toward the door as though preparing an exit. Gina, Margaret began, her voice warm but firm. Nora showed me some of the places where she's been receiving her medicine. I'm concerned about what I saw. Color rose in Gina's cheeks. She needs those treatments. You don't understand how much she was suffering before Brian started helping us. Margaret nodded, acknowledging her words without judgment. I do understand, Gina. That's why I'd like to know, when did all of this start? When did Nora first become ill? Gina's shoulders sagged. About 7 months ago. It started with stomach pains, fevers that would come and go. I took her to urgent care when it got really bad. They said it might be a urinary tract infection. Prescribed antibiotics. Her voice hardened. But they rushed us through in 15 minutes. The medicine didn't help. And when I went back, they treated me like I was overreacting. That's when I offered to help, Brian cut in smoothly, placing a hand on Gina's shoulder. I've seen this pattern too many times. Single mothers dismissed, real symptoms ignored. Nora needed someone to take her condition seriously. Daniel's eyes narrowed at the gesture. Every move Brian made was calculated, positioning himself as the only ally in Gina's world, isolating her from others who might challenge him. Mr. Keller, Daniel said evenly, what qualifications do you have to diagnose and treat medical conditions in children? Brian's smile tightened just slightly. I have extensive training in holistic medicine and nutritional therapy. I've helped dozens of families. My results speak for themselves. And the injections you've been giving Nora, Margaret added quietly. What exactly do they contain? Brian's expression didn't falter. A proprietary blend of immune-boosting compounds. Vitamins, minerals, natural elements that support healing. Completely safe. Then you won't mind if we have it analyzed, Daniel said. For the briefest moment, something sharp flashed in Brian's eyes, alarm, anger, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He forced a smile. Of course not, though I do protect my formulations as intellectual property. Years of research, you understand. Before anyone could respond, a small, shaky voice cut through the room. Mommy! All heads turned. Nora stood in the doorway, her face flushed, sweat beading at her hairline. She swayed slightly, clutching Mr. Hugs. I don't feel good, she whispered. Gina rushed to her side, pressing a hand to her forehead. She's burning up. Panic crept into her voice. In an instant, the entire dynamic shifted. Margaret pulled out her phone, already dialing. She needs a hospital, Gina. A real emergency room. Right now. Brian stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. I have something that will bring the fever down quickly, he said urgently. We've managed this before, haven't we, Gina? Daniel moved immediately, placing himself between Brian and the family. His voice was firm now, leaving no room for argument. Sir, step back. Let us handle this. For the first time, Brian's mask cracked. For just a second, his polished demeanor slipped, revealing something colder, sharper. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced with a smile that no longer seemed so reassuring. Of course, he said smoothly, raising his hand slightly. I only want what's best for Nora. But as Gina gathered her daughter into her arms, Daniel caught the look Nora gave Brian over her mother's shoulder. Fear. Confusion. A silent plea. And in that moment, Daniel knew this was only the beginning of a much darker truth waiting to be uncovered. The drive to the hospital was tense and silent, broken only by Nora's occasional whimpers. Daniel followed in his cruiser, headlights cutting through the darkness, while Gina clutched her daughter in the back seat of Margaret's car. Brian had insisted on accompanying them, but Daniel had firmly refused, making it clear that his involvement in Nora's immediate care was over for now. The look Brian had given him in that moment still lingered in Daniel's mind. Polite on the surface, but with a simmering resentment beneath, the kind of look that promised the matter wasn't finished. At the emergency department, fluorescent lights bathed everything in a sterile glow. Nurses rushed to meet them the moment they arrived, whisking Nora into a curtained bay. Gina hovered by her daughter's side, wringing her hands, her lips moving in silent prayer. Margaret remained close, a steady presence, while Daniel stood at the foot of the bed, his badge catching the light as he explained to the attending physician what had transpired. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a clipped tone, didn't hide her skepticism when Daniel described Brian's treatments. You're telling me someone has been injecting this child with unverified compounds outside of medical supervision? She asked, pulling on gloves as she prepared to examine Nora. That's correct, Daniel replied. The doctor muttered under her breath, something about reckless endangerment, before turning her attention back to Nora. Sweetheart, I need to check your arms, okay? Nora clutched Mr. Hugs tightly but nodded. The doctor gently rolled up her sleeves, revealing faint bruises along her upper arms. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, while Gina looked away, shame flooding her features. These are injection sites, the doctor confirmed grimly. Multiple recent. She looked at Gina. Do you know what he was giving her? I thought they were vitamins, Gina whispered. He said they would help. He promised she wouldn't hurt anymore. Her voice cracked, guilt wrapping around every word. Margaret touched her arm gently. Gina, you did what you thought was best for your child. You were trying to help her. That doesn't make you a bad mother, it makes you human. The words brought fresh tears to Gina's eyes, but they also softened the crushing weight pressing down on her. For months, she had carried the burden alone, trying to decipher Nora's illness while juggling work, bills, and sleepless nights. Brian had been the only one who offered answers, who didn't dismiss her worries. Now, seeing her daughter lying weak beneath the hospital's harsh lights, she realized how desperately she had wanted to believe him. The doctor ordered a battery of tests, blood work, imaging, cultures. We need to rule out infection, organ damage, toxicity, she explained. Until we know exactly what's in her system, we treat supportively, fluids, fever management, close monitoring. As nurses bustled around, attaching 4 lines and checking vitals, Gina sank into a chair, her head in her hands. Margaret sat beside her, speaking softly, grounding her with steady reassurances. Daniel remained alert, watching every detail, filing away each observation for the report he knew he'd have to write later. Hours passed in a blur. The waiting room outside the pediatric ward was quiet at this late hour, the hum of vending machines filling the silence. Daniel and Margaret sat with Gina, who alternated between dozing fitfully and jerking awake at every sound. You did the right thing calling me, Margaret said quietly to Daniel as Gina slept against her shoulder. He nodded. But I'm worried it's bigger than just one child. Brian Keller isn't new to this. He was too smooth, too practiced. He's done it before. Margaret's eyes darkened. And he'll do it again, unless someone stops him. Daniel's jaw tightened. That's what I intend to do. Just as dawn began to lighten the edges of the sky, the doctor returned. We've stabilized her fever, she reported. Initial labs show signs of immune suppression. Her white cell count is low, dangerously so for a child her age. We won't know exactly what she's been given until toxicology comes back, but my guess is these injections contain more than vitamins. Gina gasped. What does that mean? Is she going to be okay? She's stable for now, the doctor reassured her. But we'll need to keep her admitted until we understand the full scope. She paused, her tone sharpening. And I'll be filing a mandatory report. This qualifies as suspected medical abuse. The words hit Gina like a physical blow. Medical abuse? Her voice cracked, trembling. I didn't mean to hurt her. I thought I was helping. Margaret took her hands gently. Gina, listen to me. This isn't your fault. You were misled by someone who took advantage of your love for your daughter. That responsibility falls on him, not you. Tears streamed down Gina's face. I don't know what's real anymore. He made me believe he was the only one who cared. Every doctor we saw rushed us out the door, but Brian, he listened. He made me feel like I wasn't crazy. Daniel leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. That's how people like him work. They find families who are desperate, who feel ignored. They build trust, and then they use it. You weren't the first, Gina. And unless we stop him, you won't be the last. The thought made Gina's stomach twist. How many other mothers had been sitting in kitchens just like hers, clinging to Brian's words, believing they were saving their children. Later that morning, when visiting hours began, a nurse appeared at the waiting room door. There's a man asking to see Nora Whitman, she said. He says he's her care provider. Keller, I believe. Gina's face drained of color. He came here? Daniel stood immediately. Don't let him near her. I'll handle this. He found Brian at the admissions desk, speaking smoothly to the receptionist, his medical bag slung casually over his shoulder. To any passerby, he might look like a dedicated practitioner concerned for his patient. But Daniel could see the tension in his jaw, the flicker of irritation when things didn't go his way. Mr. Keller, Daniel said firmly. You need to leave. Brian turned, his smile perfectly in place. Officer, I came to check on Nora. I'm her care provider. It's my responsibility. You're not her doctor, Daniel said, his voice sharp. You're not authorized to treat her. And you're under investigation. Leave now, or I'll have you escorted out. The mask slipped again, just for an instant. Brian's eyes hardened, cold and calculating. But then he smiled, inclining his head slightly. Of course, if that's what Gina wants. He turned toward the waiting room, his gaze settling on Gina. His voice softened, coaxing, as if the police officer standing beside him didn't exist. "Gina, you know I've only ever wanted what's best for Nora. They don't understand her condition the way I do. Don't let them take that away from you." Gina froze, torn. His words still held power, tugging at the fragile threads of trust he had woven into her life. But then she looked toward Margaret, who gave her a steady, reassuring nod, and finally at her daughter's pale face through the window of the pediatric bay. "No, Brian," she said quietly, her voice trembling but resolute. "I don't want you here." For the first time, his smile faltered. Just slightly. But enough. Daniel stepped closer, his voice low and firm. "You heard her. Leave." Brian's eyes lingered on Gina, then flicked to Daniel, filled with a silent warning. Finally, he turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing down the sterile corridor. Gina collapsed back into her chair, shaking. Margaret wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "That was brave," she murmured. But even as relief washed over the group, Daniel knew it wasn't over. Men like Brian didn't just walk away. They circled, regrouped, and returned stronger. As the day wore on, Gina began to open up more, encouraged by Margaret's patient questions. She spoke of the months leading up to Brian's involvement, how she had taken Nora to 3 different clinics, each time being told it was probably viral or likely stress-related. She described the frustration of long waits, short appointments, and bills that piled higher with each visit. "I felt invisible," she admitted softly, like no one cared enough to really listen. And then Brian showed up at church one Sunday. He heard me talking to a friend about Nora, and afterward he came up to me, said he specialized in children with mystery illnesses. He sounded so confident. He told me I wasn't imagining things, that he'd seen this pattern before. For the first time, I felt seen. Her voice cracked. I wanted so badly to believe someone finally understood. "That's why I let him in." Margaret nodded gently. "Of course you did. You were exhausted, scared, and desperate for answers. That doesn't make you weak, Gina. It makes you human. But now, you see him for what he is." Gina wiped her eyes. "Yes, I do. And I'll never let him near her again." But Daniel wasn't as reassured. He knew Brian wouldn't let go easily. There was too much ego, too much control wrapped up in his role as savior. The way he had looked at Gina before leaving, it wasn't the look of a man defeated. It was the look of a man regrouping. As night fell again, Daniel stepped outside for fresh air. The hospital parking lot was quiet, the hum of distant traffic blending with the chirping of late summer crickets. He pulled out his phone, dialing a colleague in investigations. "I need everything you can dig up on a Brian Keller," he said. "Aliases, certifications, complaints, anything. He's a danger to children, and I want him stopped before another family gets hurt." On the other end of the line, his colleague promised to start digging immediately. Daniel ended the call, slipping his phone back into his pocket. His gaze drifted to the far edge of the parking lot, where a lone figure leaned against a car. Even in the dim light, Daniel recognized the posture, the silhouette, the faint glint of a polished smile. Brian Keller. He wasn't gone. He was waiting, watching, and Daniel knew with grim certainty that the storm had only just begun. Daniel sat at his desk late into the night, the glow of his computer monitor painting tired shadows across his face. The hospital had agreed to keep extra security near Nora's room, but he knew that wasn't enough. Men like Brian Keller didn't simply walk away when told no. They thrived on resistance. For Brian, each rejection was a challenge, a puzzle to solve, a wall to scale. Daniel had seen it before in different forms: abusers who cloaked themselves in charm, predators who wore the mask of healers, manipulators who rewrote the truth until even their victims doubted reality. The search began with official databases. Keller's name turned up only once in the state's registry, not as a licensed medical professional, but as a business owner of a wellness and family health consultancy. The license, Daniel noted, was a simple business permit, nothing to do with healthcare. No medical board certifications, no recognized qualifications, just paperwork that allowed him to open shop. That in itself wasn't illegal. Plenty of self-styled consultants operated under similar pretenses. What concerned Daniel were the gaps. No record of where Keller had trained, no degrees listed, and only a brief mention of prior employment at a private wellness practice that had since dissolved. Curious, Daniel called his contact in the investigative bureau, a sharp-minded analyst named Erica. Within an hour, she sent him a preliminary report. It was sparse on direct evidence, but full of breadcrumbs. Keller had relocated 3 times in the past decade, each time following a strikingly similar pattern. In one town, he had worked with children diagnosed with chronic fatigue. In another, with kids suffering from recurrent migraines. Each time, he built a network of desperate parents who swore by his methods, until complaints began surfacing. Erica had flagged at least 2 incidents in which families had filed reports of adverse effects from his treatments. Yet neither case had ever made it to court. "He's slippery," Erica told Daniel over the phone. "He avoids using specific medical terminology in his advertisements, never prescribes anything formally, and frames everything as holistic support. Legally, that muddies the water. Parents technically consent to what he's doing, which makes prosecuting him a nightmare." Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "But kids are getting hurt." "Yeah," Erica sighed. "And unless one of them ends up with documented long-term damage and a parent willing to testify, he skates by every time. My guess? He leaves town the moment heat builds." Daniel's stomach twisted. Gina had almost been another quiet statistic, another mother carrying shame, too embarrassed to admit she'd been fooled. If Margaret hadn't intervened, if he hadn't been called that night, Nora might have been a file in some closed folder marked unsubstantiated. When Daniel returned to the hospital the next morning, he found Gina sitting by Nora's bed, looking pale but steadier. Margaret sat beside her, crocheting calmly, the rhythmic click of her needles filling the silence. "She's been resting better," Gina whispered as Daniel entered. "No fever overnight. The doctors say her numbers are still low, but stable." "That's good," Daniel replied. His eyes softened as he looked at Nora, curled around Mr. Huggs, her small chest rising and falling evenly. For the first time since the ordeal began, she seemed truly at peace. Daniel hesitated before sitting. "Gina, I need to ask you something difficult. Has Brian ever mentioned working with other families? Anyone you know from church, maybe?" Gina frowned. "He did once. He said he'd helped a boy in the next county with recurring fevers. He even offered to put me in touch with the family to prove his track record, he called it. But I never followed up." Margaret lowered her crochet, her eyes sharp. "Of course he said that. It's part of the act, credibility by association. If you'd asked for proof, I guarantee he'd find some way to dodge it." Daniel nodded. "That lines up with what we're finding. He's done this in other towns, always with children who have symptoms that frustrate conventional doctors." Gina's face tightened with guilt. "So I wasn't the first mother he tricked." "No," Daniel said gently. "And you won't be the last unless we build a case strong enough to stop him." The weight of his words settled over them like fog. Gina reached for Margaret's hand, clinging as though anchoring herself to solid ground. Margaret squeezed back firmly, grounding her in the moment. Later that afternoon, Daniel stepped into the hallway to take a call from Erica. She had tracked down one of the families Keller had worked with years ago, the parents of a little girl named Lila, who had suffered from unexplained stomach pain. "They agreed to talk," Erica said. "But they're cautious. They felt humiliated when things went south. If you approach them, tread gently." Daniel promised he would, then returned to update Gina. "There are others," he told her. "Families who went through the same thing. I'm going to speak to them. The more people who come forward, the stronger our case." That night, Gina lay awake in the chair beside Nora's bed, Margaret dozing lightly in another. The hospital lights hummed quietly, casting everything in muted tones. In the stillness, Gina's mind replayed Brian's words, the soothing reassurances, the way he had looked her in the eye and told her she was a good mother. She shuddered, pulling her sweater tighter around herself. How had she let him get so close? A shadow shifted in the hallway. Gina's breath caught. For a moment, she thought she saw him, Brian, standing at the edge of the ward, watching. But when she blinked, the space was empty. She pressed a hand to her chest, forcing herself to breathe. It could have been her imagination. Or maybe not. The next day, Daniel drove out to meet Lila's parents. The family lived in a modest ranch-style home on the edge of town, a neat garden framing the front steps. When the door opened, a weary-looking woman in her 40s stood before him. "You're the officer Erica mentioned," she said quietly. "Come in." Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and lavender. The woman, Alice, guided Daniel to the living room, where her husband Mark sat stiffly on the couch. They exchanged polite greetings before Alice began. "It was 3 years ago," she said, her voice low. "Our daughter, Lila, was always complaining of stomach aches. We went to every doctor we could, pediatricians, specialists, even a gastroenterologist. They all said the same thing, nothing serious. Maybe stress, maybe diet. But she kept hurting, and we kept searching. Daniel listened carefully, his pen moving across the page. Then we met Brian Keller, Alice continued. He seemed like a godsend. He told us he'd treated children with the exact same symptoms. He spoke with such confidence, such warmth. He made us feel like we weren't crazy, like we weren't failing as parents. Mark's jaw tightened. He told us he had a formula, natural supplements, he called them. We paid hundreds for vials of liquid he said would rebalance her system. Lila hated the taste, but we insisted because we believed him. Alice's eyes glistened. After a few weeks, she got worse. Nausea, fatigue, constant fevers. We called Brian desperate. He said it was a healing crisis, her body adjusting. He convinced us to keep going. Her voice broke. One night, she collapsed. We rushed her to the ER. The doctors said her liver enzymes were off the charts. They kept asking what we'd given her. When we finally told them, they looked horrified. We realized then what we'd done. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She recovered, thank God, but we'll never forgive ourselves for trusting him. Daniel closed his notebook gently. You're not alone. He's doing it again. Another little girl is in the hospital right now because of him. But your story can help stop him. Mark's eyes hardened. If it means keeping him from hurting more kids, we'll tell anyone who'll listen. Driving back into town, Daniel felt both heaviness and resolve. The pattern was clear. Brian Keller thrived on desperation, weaving trust with carefully chosen words, and leaving wreckage behind. But now Daniel had names, testimonies, and a growing network of voices willing to speak. When he returned to the hospital, he found Gina pacing the hallway, wringing her hands. Daniel, I swear I saw him, she whispered. Last night, just outside Nora's room. I thought I imagined it, but what if he's still here? Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I'll make sure he doesn't get near her again. You don't have to face him alone anymore. But deep down, Daniel knew the truth. Brian Keller wasn't finished. Men like him never quit quietly. That night, as Daniel pulled out of the hospital parking lot, his headlights caught movement near the far hedge. A figure stood there, half hidden, watching. The gleam of a smile flashed briefly in the darkness before vanishing into shadow. Brian Keller. Waiting. And Daniel understood with grim certainty that the game was only escalating. The waiting area outside Nora's hospital room smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee, the kind of sterile comfort designed to keep people calm, while hiding the undercurrent of fear that ran through every corridor. Gina sat hunched in one of the stiff-backed chairs, her hands twisting a tissue into threads, her face pale with exhaustion. Margaret sat beside her, knitting with quiet determination, the rhythmic click of her needles cutting through the silence. It was a sound that anchored Gina, something steady in a world that had become unbearably unstable. Daniel returned from another meeting with the hospital administrators, his expression grim. He had just secured an additional round of security checks, but he knew that wouldn't deter someone like Brian Keller for long. Predators thrived in the spaces where rules grew thin, where vigilance faltered. And Brian was circling closer each day. Any news? Gina asked, her voice shaky, eyes darting toward the hallway as though expecting him to appear at any moment. Daniel crouched in front of her, speaking low and calm. We've got witnesses. Families who've been through what you've been through. They're ready to talk. It's not enough to put him away yet, but it's a start. And it means you're not alone in this anymore. Margaret's needles paused, her gaze sharp as glass. And what about here? About the fact that he's still hovering like a vulture outside these walls? Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't want to scare them further, but the truth was inescapable. Brian had been seen too many times near the hospital, once by Gina herself, once by a nurse during her smoke break. Each sighting was brief, fleeting, like a shadow that disappeared the moment you turned your head. Yet the effect was suffocating. He wanted them to feel hunted. He wanted to remind them that his grip hadn't truly loosened. As if summoned by the thought, the automatic doors at the far end of the ward hissed open. And there he was. Brian Keller walked in with the casual stride of a man who believed he belonged everywhere he stepped. His hair was neatly combed, his shirt pressed, his smile polite but tinged with smugness. He carried a small leather satchel slung across one shoulder, the same one Daniel had seen before, the bag of his so-called remedies. He moved like he had every right to be there, ignoring the startled looks of nurses and visitors, his eyes sweeping the room until they landed on Gina. Her breath hitched, a choked sound caught between fear and disbelief. No, she whispered, shrinking back into her chair. Margaret set her knitting aside, her body going rigid, the needles slipping silently into her bag. Her voice dropped to a steely whisper. Stay seated, Gina. Don't give him ground. Daniel rose slowly, placing himself between Brian and the women. You're not supposed to be here, he said, his tone calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. Brian's smile widened, as though Daniel's resistance were nothing more than a child's tantrum. Officer Wyatt, he greeted smoothly. Always a pleasure. I was just stopping by to check on Nora. I heard she wasn't doing well, and I thought maybe I could help. Help? Daniel barked a bitter laugh. You've done enough already. Get out. Brian tilted his head, feigning innocence. Why are you so hostile? Gina knows I've only ever wanted what's best for her daughter. His gaze flicked past Daniel, landing on Gina. Isn't that right? You asked for my help. You trusted me because you knew the doctors weren't listening. Gina's lips trembled, her hands twisting tighter around the shredded tissue. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Margaret's voice cut through the fog. Don't you dare put this back on her. You manipulated a struggling mother until she doubted her own judgment. That's not care, Brian. That's control. For a fraction of a second, Brian's mask slipped. His jaw twitched, his smile straining at the edges. Then just as quickly, he smoothed it over. Margaret, he said warmly, always the crusader. But you of all people should understand, traditional systems fail families every day. I simply step in where bureaucracy lets them down. Daniel took a step forward, close enough now that he could see the faint sheen of sweat at Brian's temple. This is your last warning. Leave, or I'll have you escorted out in cuffs. Brian didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned ever so slightly to the side, addressing Gina directly. You know I'm right. You've seen the changes in Nora when she took my treatments. She smiled again, didn't she? She had energy. The doctors will fill her with chemicals, but I... Stop! Gina's cry rang through the waiting room, startling even herself. Her voice cracked, but the words carried the sharp edge of breaking glass. Stop twisting everything. You made me believe I was helping her, when all I did was hurt her worse. The tissue in her hands tore apart completely, falling to the floor in limp shreds. Tears streamed down her cheeks. I let you into my home. I let you near my baby. And now she's lying in that bed because I trusted you. Brian's eyes narrowed, the charm draining away to reveal something colder, darker. So this is how it is, he said softly. You turn on me now, after everything I've done for you? Daniel took advantage of the moment, gesturing sharply toward the nearby security guard, who had been watching uneasily from the corner. Within seconds, 2 guards moved in, flanking Brian. You'll regret this, Brian murmured, his voice low, meant only for Gina. His eyes locked on hers, an unsettling mixture of anger and promise. When the doctors fail you again, you'll remember me, and you'll wish you'd listened. Get him out of here, Daniel ordered. The guards seized Brian's arms, guiding him firmly toward the doors. He didn't resist, not physically. But as he was led away, his smile returned, eerie and confident, as though this setback were only a temporary inconvenience. When the doors shut behind him, the waiting room exhaled in collective relief. Gina collapsed back into her chair, shaking uncontrollably. Margaret reached over, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, whispering soothing words as Gina buried her face against her chest. Daniel remained standing, fists clenched, watching the empty space where Brian had been. His gut churned with unease. Men like Keller didn't walk away quietly. Every fiber of Daniel's experience told him this wasn't over. It was only beginning. Hours later, after Gina had finally calmed and Margaret had guided her back to Nora's room, Daniel lingered in the hospital parking lot. The night air was cool, laced with the faint hum of distant traffic. He leaned against his car, staring at the glow of the city lights beyond. His phone buzzed. It was Erica. You'll want to hear this, she said briskly. We pulled some more threads on Keller. Found bank transfers tied to his so-called practice. Families paying thousands for custom treatments. And get this, he's got a shell company routing money offshore. He's not just dabbling in fake medicine. He's running a full-blown con operation. Daniel's stomach tightened. How soon can you get me the full report? By morning, Erica said. But there's more. One of the families we contacted, the father swore Keller threatened him after he pulled his daughter out. Said Keller warned he'd regret turning away. Daniel's mind flashed to Brian's parting words to Gina. The pattern was too clear to ignore. Keller wasn't simply delusional, he was dangerous. When Daniel returned inside, he found Gina sitting once again by Nora's bedside. The child stirred, blinking sleepily, reaching for her mother's hand. Mommy, she whispered. I'm here, baby, Gina murmured, brushing hair from her daughter's forehead. Daniel watched them quietly for a moment, the bond between them radiating like a fragile but unbreakable thread. Then he stepped closer. "Gina," he said softly, "I need you to prepare yourself. Keller won't give up easily, but you're not facing him alone anymore. We're building a case, piece by piece, and when it's ready, we'll make sure he can't hurt anyone else." Gina nodded weakly, her eyes never leaving Nora. "I just want her safe, whatever it takes." And in that quiet hospital room, beneath the hum of machines and the soft beeping of monitors, Daniel vowed silently to himself. He would not let Brian Keller win. Not this time. The hospital took on a different rhythm at night. Hallways that had bustled with visitors and medical staff during the day now carried only the occasional echo of hurried footsteps, or the low hum of a nurse pushing a cart. The fluorescent lights seemed softer, dim to preserve the fragile calm of patients trying to sleep. For Gina, though, sleep was impossible. She sat vigil by Nora's bed, her fingers gently stroking the child's fine hair, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. Every beep of the monitor was both a comfort and a reminder of how close she had come to losing her little girl. Margaret dozed in a chair nearby, her knitting needles silent for once, a ball of yarn resting in her lap. Daniel had checked in earlier, his expression grim, before leaving to continue the investigation. Though he had reassured Gina that she wasn't alone, the silence of the room made her feel like she was still fighting shadows she couldn't escape. Nora stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice raspy from sleep. "I'm here, sweetheart," Gina murmured, leaning closer. She pressed a kiss to her daughter's temple, her heart aching with both love and guilt. "Do I have to see him again?" Nora asked, her small hand clutching Mr. Hugs, the teddy bear that rarely left her side. Gina's throat tightened. "No, baby. You'll never have to see him again. I promise." But even as she spoke, her mind replayed Brian's chilling words. "You'll regret this. When the doctors fail you again, you'll remember me." It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise, one he fully intended to keep. The next morning brought more unease. Daniel returned with Erica, his fellow officer, carrying a thick folder of documents. They gathered in a quiet conference room just down the hall, away from Nora's ears. Gina sat across from them, Margaret at her side, her knitting bag resting on the table, as though she were ready to pull out her needles at any moment, a quiet act of defiance in the face of fear. Daniel slid the folder toward Gina. "This is what we've uncovered about Brian Keller. He's not a certified practitioner of anything. He calls himself a holistic healer, but it's all smoke and mirrors. His real skill is finding families at their weakest and convincing them that he's the only one who cares." Erica flipped open the folder, revealing bank statements, testimonials, and pages of notes. "We traced payments from several families, all desperate parents of sick children. Some paid him thousands for treatments that didn't work. In some cases, kids got worse. One family pulled out when they realized the shots made their daughter violently ill. Keller threatened them, said they'd regret it if they went to the authorities." Margaret's mouth tightened into a thin line. Classic predator behavior. Isolation, manipulation, financial exploitation. He knows exactly where to press on people's fears. Gina stared at the papers, her stomach churning. The names of the other families blurred as tears filled her eyes. She wasn't the only one. She had thought her situation was unique, that her desperation had blinded her alone. But there were others, mothers and fathers, who had been caught in the same web of lies. How many children?" she asked, her voice trembling. Erica glanced at Daniel before answering. "At least 6 that we know of. Maybe more. Most didn't go to the police because they were too ashamed or afraid of what Keller might do." Gina pressed her hands to her face, muffling a sob. Margaret reached over, steadying her with a gentle squeeze. "You're not powerless, Gina. By speaking up, by telling the truth, you're giving those other families courage. You're breaking his hold." Daniel leaned forward, his voice calm but urgent. "We're building a case. It'll take time, but it's strong. And with your testimony, with Nora's medical records, we can show exactly what Keller's been doing. He won't be able to hide behind charm or lies anymore." But even as Daniel spoke, his gut twisted with unease. Keller had resources. He wasn't just a smooth talker with a satchel of syringes. He was careful, calculated, and dangerous. People like him didn't go down without a fight. That night, after the meeting, Daniel stayed at the hospital longer than usual. He couldn't shake the feeling that Keller was still close, circling like a predator in the dark. He stationed himself near the main entrance, scanning every person who came and went, his instincts on high alert. At one point, he thought he saw a familiar silhouette near the edge of the parking lot, tall, broad-shouldered, standing just beyond the reach of the lights. But when he blinked, the figure was gone. Inside Nora's room, the atmosphere was softer. Gina had crawled into the narrow hospital bed beside her daughter, curling protectively around her small body. Nora clutched Mr. Huggs tightly, murmuring in her sleep, "No more medicine, no more needles." Gina kissed the crown of her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Never again, baby. Never again." Margaret sat nearby, her knitting needles clicking softly once more. The rhythm filled the silence, a steady heartbeat against the uncertainty that loomed outside. She glanced at Gina and Nora, her eyes softening. "She's stronger than she looks, you know," she said quietly. "Children have a way of finding light, even in the darkest places. But she'll need you to keep holding that light steady." Gina nodded, her chest tightening. "I just hope I'm strong enough." "You are," Margaret said firmly. "You've already proven it. You stood up to him. That wasn't easy. But you did it for her. And you'll keep doing it, one day at a time." The following days blurred into a rhythm of doctor visits, tests, and cautious optimism. Nora's color slowly returned, her cheeks flushing with the faintest sign of health. She even managed a weak smile one morning when the nurse brought her a balloon. For the first time in weeks, Gina felt a flicker of hope. But outside the hospital walls, the storm was gathering. Daniel received a call from Erica, just as he was leaving the station late one evening. "You're not going to like this," she said. Keller lawyered up. Not just any lawyer, either. Some high-powered defense guy out of state. Somebody's funding him. Daniel cursed under his breath. "So he's got backing. Great. That means this goes beyond just him playing healer. He's got connections." "Exactly," Erica replied. "And if that's true, we're not just fighting Keller. We're fighting whoever profits from what he's doing." Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter. The case had just become bigger, more dangerous, and far more complicated. Back at the hospital, Gina wasn't aware of the latest development, but she could feel the tension in Daniel's voice whenever he spoke. She knew the fight wasn't over. Still, she clung to the small victories. Nora eating more, her laughter returning in fleeting bursts, the way her tiny hand fit perfectly in hers. One evening, Nora asked to draw. The nurse brought her crayons and paper, and she sat cross-legged in bed, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth as she concentrated. When she finished, she proudly held up her picture. Herself, her mother, and Mr. Huggs, all holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Gina's heart swelled. "It's beautiful," she whispered, hugging her daughter tightly. But then she noticed the faint outline of another figure in the corner of the page, drawn in black, looming and tall, with eyes that seemed to stare right through. "Who's that?" Gina asked gently. Nora's expression darkened, her voice small. "That's him. He watches, even when he's not here." Gina's breath caught, and she clutched her daughter tighter, whispering promises of safety. But the truth was inescapable. Even in his absence, Brian Keller's shadow stretched long and far. The days that followed carried with them a strange mix of hope and dread. Nora's cheeks had begun to pinken again, her laughter fluttering in small bursts like fragile birds testing their wings. Doctors reassured Gina that her daughter was responding well to proper treatment. The fever had broken, the mysterious substances were clearing from her system, and for the first time in weeks, the little girl seemed less like a shadow and more like herself. But outside the cocoon of that hospital room, the fight against Brian Keller was far from over. Daniel arrived one morning, his uniform crisp but his face lined with fatigue. He carried a manila folder under his arm and placed it gently on the windowsill before addressing Gina and Margaret, who were sitting beside Nora's bed. "We've got more," he said simply. Margaret set aside her knitting, her sharp eyes narrowing. "What kind of more?" Daniel exhaled, his jaw tight. "The lab ran a full analysis on the vials we recovered from Keller's bag. They weren't herbal tonics or vitamins like he claimed. They contained a mixture of unregulated chemicals, some of which are used in veterinary medicine. Others aren't even approved for human use." Gina's stomach turned, bile rising in her throat. "He was giving that to my child?" Her voice cracked, trembling with both rage and shame. Daniel nodded grimly. "Yes, and not just your child. We've linked his treatments to at least 3 other kids who ended up in the ER with unexplained illnesses. Their parents didn't know what to do at the time, so they stayed quiet. But now that we've connected the dots, they're talking. Keller's pattern is clear." Margaret leaned forward, her voice steady. "This is how men like him operate. They thrive in secrecy. But once the truth comes to light, their power begins to crumble." Gina buried her face in her hands. Her mind flooded with images of Nora wincing, whispering, "It only hurts the first time." Each word was now a dagger. She had let Keller into her home, into her daughter's body, into their lives. Sensing her spiraling, Margaret touched her shoulder firmly. "Listen to me. He wanted you to believe you had no choices. But you do. And by standing here now, you're proving he didn't win." Daniel flipped open the folder, revealing photographs of evidence. Syringes, bottles, notes scribbled with half-scientific jargon meant to sound legitimate. Among them was a ledger with names, dates, and amounts paid. Gina's own name leapt from the page, a painful reminder of the money she had handed over in desperation. But what chilled her most was a column of numbers, dosages, times, and remarks. Next to Nora's name, Keller had written "responding well, increased dose gradually." Her vision blurred with tears. Responding well. The words mocked her, twisted and cruel. He had seen her child not as a person, but as an experiment. Daniel closed the folder softly, as though even the paper carried weight. "We're bringing him in for questioning. We have enough to hold him. It won't be easy, he's got lawyers, and he knows how to charm. But this time, he won't be able to talk his way out of everything." The following afternoon, Keller was escorted into an interrogation room at the station. The cameras whirred quietly in the corners as he sat across from Daniel and Erica, his hands folded neatly, his expression calm, too calm. Dressed in a pressed button-down shirt and tailored jacket, he looked more like a professor than a criminal. "You've got it all wrong," Keller said smoothly, his voice dripping with controlled indignation. "I've dedicated my life to helping families who've been abandoned by the medical system. Desperate parents come to me when doctors shrug their shoulders. I've given them hope. And this is how you repay me? By dragging my name through the mud." Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Hope doesn't land kids in the ER. Hope doesn't fill their veins with poison." Keller smirked. "Poison? That's a strong word for supplements you don't understand. My treatments are cutting edge, beyond the narrow vision of conventional medicine. Just because the FDA hasn't caught up doesn't make me a criminal." Erica slid the photographs across the table. "These vials contain chemicals not approved for human use. We have lab results. We have medical records showing direct harm. You can spin it however you want, Keller, but the facts are the facts." For the first time, Keller's jaw tightened ever so slightly. But then he leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Do you know how many parents beg me for help? Do you know how many children are alive today because of me? You think you're saving people by stopping me, but you're not. You're condemning them." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What about Nora Whitman? You call what you did to her saving. She almost died because of you." Keller's expression flickered, just briefly, with something darker. Then he smiled. "Her mother came to me. She asked for my help. I didn't force my way into their lives. She chose me." The words cut like knives, and Daniel's hand curled into a fist on the table. He wanted to lash out, to wipe that smug smile off Keller's face, but he held back. Keller thrived on control, on finding the cracks in people's armor. Daniel would not give him that satisfaction. Back at the hospital, Gina paced restlessly, her nerves stretched thin. Margaret tried to distract Nora with stories and coloring, but the little girl sensed the tension. She looked up from her drawing, her eyes wide and solemn. "Is he gone, Mommy? For real?" Gina knelt beside her, brushing hair from her forehead. "The police are talking to him now. They won't let him hurt you again." "But what if he comes back?" Nora whispered, her grip on Mr. Huggs tightening until her knuckles turned white. Gina swallowed hard. She wanted to promise her daughter absolute safety, but the truth was more complicated. Keller had money, lawyers, and a manipulative charm that had fooled her once. What if it fooled others, too? Margaret, sensing Gina's struggle, leaned over and addressed Nora gently. "Sweetheart, sometimes bad people try to make us believe they're stronger than they are. But the truth is, when people stand together, when they tell the truth, the bad people lose their power. That's what your mommy is doing now. She's making sure he can't hurt anyone else." Nora's eyes softened, and for the first time, she let go of Mr. Huggs just enough to slip her tiny hand into her mother's. Meanwhile, at the station, Keller's polished facade was beginning to fray. Under the steady pressure of Erica's questions and Daniel's silent intensity, his answers grew sharper, more defensive. He alternated between portraying himself as a martyr and lashing out at the medical establishment, at desperate parents, at anyone but himself. Finally, Daniel leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "You can keep pretending you're a savior. But you and I both know the truth. You preyed on families when they were at their weakest. You took their money, their trust, their children's health, and you gambled with it. That's not healing. That's cruelty. For a split second, Keller's mask slipped. His eyes hardened, his mouth tightening into a sneer. You think you're better than me? You think those families wouldn't have begged for anything, paid anything, when doctors turned them away? I gave them what they wanted, what they needed. And if they suffered, well, suffering is part of healing. The words hung in the air, chilling and raw. Erica's hand moved instinctively to stop the recording timer, but Daniel gestured for her to let it run. They had what they needed, a glimpse of Keller's true self, stripped of charm and pretense. That evening, Daniel returned to the hospital, exhaustion weighing heavy on his shoulders. He stood quietly in the doorway of Nora's room, watching as Gina read a bedtime story aloud, her voice trembling but steady. Nora snuggled against her, Mr. Huggs nestled under her chin. Margaret caught Daniel's eye and gave a small nod. He stepped into the room, and Gina looked up, her eyes searching his face. "How did it go?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. He showed his true colors. "It's not over yet. He's got a lawyer, and this will drag out. But we've got enough to fight him. And we're not alone. Other families are coming forward. They're ready to stand with you." Gina's lips parted, relief and fear mingling in her expression. "So he won't?" Daniel shook his head. "He's not invincible. He wants you to think he is, but he's not. And with every voice that joins yours, his grip weakens." Nora stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at Daniel sleepily and whispered, "You'll keep us safe, right?" Daniel crouched beside her, his voice steady. "Always, kiddo. Always." And for the first time in a long while, Gina believed him. The sterile white of the hospital room gradually began to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. Days blended into one another, but this time, they carried a rhythm of healing instead of fear. Nora's cheeks had grown rounder again. Her laughter slipped into conversations with nurses, and her small body no longer trembled each time someone in scrubs entered the room. Gina remained close, rarely leaving her daughter's side. Sometimes she sat in the stiff hospital chair, staring at the muted television with her thoughts heavy and dark. Other times she curled in bed with Nora, clutching her little girl as if proximity alone could anchor her to safety. Margaret came daily, carrying her knitting and quiet wisdom, and Daniel checked in whenever he could, his presence steady and grounding. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the room in hues of orange and pink, Nora tugged gently at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy," she asked softly. "Yes, baby? Do I still have to be brave?" The question broke something in Gina's chest. She leaned down, kissing Nora's forehead, breathing in the clean scent of shampoo and the faint sweetness of apple juice. "You don't have to be brave anymore, my love. You just get to be a little girl again." Nora smiled sleepily, eyes fluttering shut. For the first time in weeks, her dreams carried her into peace rather than fear. While Nora rested, the world outside moved forward. Keller was formally charged with multiple counts: practicing medicine without a license, child endangerment, fraud, and more. Families who had once stayed silent now found their courage. 3 mothers came forward, their voices trembling but resolute, each one echoing the same story of manipulation, promises, and eventual harm. The case gained traction in local media. Headlines read, "Self-proclaimed healer indicted after children hospitalized." The public was divided. Some still defended him, swayed by his charisma and the illusion of success, while others rallied behind the families, outraged that such deception had gone unchecked for so long. Daniel had seen this before, the way predators cloaked themselves in good intentions, hiding behind jargon and charm. But with each new testimony, the cracks in Keller's armor widened. His confidence in the interrogation room had faltered, and now, under the weight of evidence and witnesses, it began to collapse entirely. At the hospital, Gina received a call from the district attorney's office. They wanted her statement, her testimony. The thought of sitting in a courtroom, of facing Keller's cold, calculating gaze again, made her stomach churn. She twisted the phone cord in her hand, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can do this." Margaret, sitting across from her, placed down her knitting needles. "You can. Not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Do you know how many parents are watching you right now, whether you realize it or not? Your voice could be the one that helps them find theirs." Gina nodded slowly, tears filling her eyes. I feel so guilty. I let him in. I believed him. Margaret leaned forward, her tone sharp but kind. "Guilt has no place here. You loved your daughter. You wanted to save her. And when the truth came to light, you acted. That is what matters. Don't let him take more from you by drowning in what-ifs." The words settled over Gina like a blanket, heavy but comforting. For the first time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, she could transform her shame into something stronger, resolve. Weeks later, the courtroom smelled faintly of wood polish and paper, the quiet murmurs of spectators filling the air. Gina sat in the witness stand, her hands clasped tightly together. Across the room, Keller sat at the defense table, his tailored suit impeccable, his hair slicked back, his smile faint but still present. The prosecutor asked Gina to recount her experience. Each word was an effort, her voice wavering, but she spoke the truth. How she had met Keller, how he had convinced her of his so-called treatments, how Nora had whispered those haunting words. It only hurts the first time. At one point, the defense attorney objected, claiming emotional manipulation, but the judge overruled. The courtroom remained still, every ear tuned to Gina's trembling but determined testimony. When she finished, tears streaking her face, she looked briefly toward Keller. His eyes met hers, and for a fleeting second, she saw not the charming healer but the predator beneath. And she felt nothing but defiance. He no longer had power over her. After days of testimony, the verdict came, guilty on multiple counts. The gavel struck, echoing through the chamber like a closing door. Keller's mask cracked completely then, his smile vanishing, his composure slipping as he realized his empire of lies had crumbled. For Gina, it wasn't victory she felt so much as release. The burden she had carried, the guilt, the fear, the shame, began to lift piece by piece. Back at the hospital, Nora was nearly ready to go home. She bounded down the hallways with renewed strength, clutching Mr. Hugs and waving at nurses who cheered her on. She was still small, still fragile in some ways, but her spirit had returned. On their last night in the hospital, Daniel stopped by one final time. He leaned against the doorway, his expression soft. "Looks like someone's ready to bust out of here," he said with a smile. Nora giggled. "I told Mommy I don't like hospital food. I want pancakes." Daniel chuckled. "Pancakes sound like a good plan." Gina approached, her eyes glistening. "I don't even know how to thank you, Daniel. For everything." He shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. Just keep moving forward. You and Nora deserve a fresh start." Margaret, sitting nearby, added warmly, "And remember, you're not alone. None of us are. That's what people like Keller want us to believe, that we have no one. But now you know better." Gina nodded, her chest swelling with gratitude. She had entered this battle broken and uncertain, but she was leaving with her daughter in her arms, supported by people who had stood beside her. A week later, Nora sat at the kitchen table at home, crayons scattered before her. She bent over a piece of paper, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth as she scribbled furiously. When she was done, she proudly held it up for her mother. It was a drawing of herself, Gina, and Mr. Hugs, all smiling, standing under a bright sun. There were no marks, no bandages, no shadows. Just joy. "See, Mommy?" she said brightly. "We're happy now." Gina's throat tightened, tears threatening, but this time they were tears of relief. She hugged her daughter tightly, whispering, "Yes, baby. We're happy now." For the first time in what felt like forever, those words were true. This story reminds us how vulnerable moments can open doors to both danger and resilience. Gina's journey wasn't about perfection. It was about courage, about finding strength in the darkest moments, and about listening to the quiet bravery of a little girl who dared to speak up. We share stories like these not only to grieve what could have been lost, but to celebrate what was saved. To honor the protectors, the truth-tellers, and the survivors who refused to stay silent. And now, dear listener, if this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of love, resilience, and community, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more stories of hope, healing, and humanity to light. Thank you for watching. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.